8:39 exactly, and we now have Jeenah, Executive Director of Afro-Middle East Center, to talk to us about what does the Taliban's return to power mean for Afghanistan. And I think it's not only Afghanistan. I should imagine the question should be, and globally, the Western world, because undoubtedly the Taliban coming into power has taken the entire world by total surprise. Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Nice to have you on the show. And what does the Taliban's return to power mean, Naeem? We've seen horrific video clips of scores of people chasing behind the US military planes. A couple of them managed to hold on, but once the plane was airborne, sadly, we saw the horror of those people falling to their deaths, and people rushing to the borders with Pakistan and other countries, trying to get out of Afghanistan. What is that saying to us as well?
Well, in terms of the people, certainly the ones at the airport that were trying to get out on this plane, there are two groups of people trying to get out of the country. The one group is those who worked for the Americans and were promised by the US that they would that their migration to the US would be facilitated once the American troops withdrew. And so they are hoping that those promises will be fulfilled, and they feel a sense of betrayal being left behind. So certainly at the airport, that was a big group of those who were there.
Mm.
The other group is Afghans who are afraid, who are concerned about the uncertainty and about the future, and particularly if they lived through the 1996-2001 period of Taliban rule. They don't want to risk having to experience that again. And I think that also, that certainly is a very legitimate fear.
Mm. Okay, we know that Afghanistan, we had approximately 10 years of occupation by the Russians. Why were they there in the first place? And the moment they left, there seemed to have been this gap. And then you get the Americans come in and they stayed on for 20 years. But the Americans being there was indirect retaliation to the 9/11 bombings in the States. Talk to us about those issues, because there's a podcast circulating. Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State, US Secretary of State, has accepted the fact that the US regime funded the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. She goes on to say that we, the United States, has created the problem that we're fighting today.
Okay, so let me just talk a little about that history before coming to Hillary Clinton. Afghanistan had a monarchy. The monarchy was overthrown, and for about half a decade there was a republican system in place, which was then overthrown by a socialist government. The Soviet Union came in at some point to support that socialist government, which was under threat of being overthrown. And that was from 1979 to 1989. It was in that period that the United States supported financially, through weapons, etc., various of these so-called Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan in order to fight against the Soviet Union, including Al-Qaeda. And in 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew. The socialist government took about 2 more years to fall, and a new government was formed of some of those Mujahideen groups. Even as it was being formed, there was internecine conflict between them and a civil war that went on from around 1990. And the state of security in the country deteriorated. In particular, the security for women, but in general, we heard stories of women being raped in various places by some of those so-called Mujahideen forces, etc. This was when the Taliban was formed in 1994, mainly Afghan students who were studying in Pakistan in the Darul Ulooms there, formed the Taliban militia, swept into Afghanistan, and 2 years later took over the country and established their rule in 1996. They were in place until 2001. In that period, we had some horrific things going on, perpetrated by the Taliban. We had, the things that we now hear a lot about, the denial of women's education. We had persecution of minorities, particularly the Shia Hazara, and various other kinds of denials of freedoms, etc., including people not being allowed to watch TVs and all kinds of things. In 2001, the 9/11 attack happened. On the 11th of September 2001, the United States insisted that the Taliban must hand over Osama bin Laden, who was being hosted, or Al-Qaeda was being hosted in a sense, by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban refused unless they were given proper evidence to implicate Al-Qaeda, which I guess was a fair demand. The United States refused, and on the 14th of October, just a month after the 11th of September attack, they invaded Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban government. I should just say that a few years before that, there were plans by Unocal, the American oil company, to build a pipeline from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. The Taliban had agreed to that and then withdrew the agreement. Whether that had anything to do with the fact that the Americans invaded, we're not sure, but it's possible.
Okay.
After the Taliban were overthrown, various governments were put in place by the Americans. Initially, Hamid Karzai, who, by the way, before that worked for Unocal, and other governments. And the Americans were there, as you say, for 20 years. They promised to bring democracy as they do to the rest of the world. They promised to put into place an accountable government, which they didn't do. They promised to train the security forces, etc., which they didn't do. None of that were they able to do. Their objective kept changing. First, it was to destroy Al-Qaeda. Then it was to destroy the Taliban. Then it was to get rid of corruption. Then back to the Taliban, etc.
Okay.
As for Hillary Clinton,
just before you respond to that question, we've had a couple of callers call in. Someone's asking, would you say that 2001 and 2021 is not the same? Question number one. Question number two, the Taliban appear very mature and none of what is claimed about their treatment of women has occurred so far. It is early days yet, Naeem, but how do you comment to those two questions?
I don't see the similarity between 2001 and 2021. I'm not sure what the question is asking. As for the second question, look, we have two things here. One is a 5-year experience of governance under the Taliban, 1996 to 2001, which was quite horrific for many Afghan people, particularly women, but not only women. Persecution of, as I said, Shias and others, etc. That's on the one hand, that experience. On the other hand, we have this, a group that is calling itself, in a sense, the new Taliban, not new in terms of the people, but new in terms of its ideas and policies. In the past 5 days or so that it has been in the presidential palace in Kabul, or from before that, they made a number of promises saying this is what the new Taliban will be. In the past 5 days or so that they've been in the presidential palace, they've not gone against those. So we saw, for example, we've had a few violations in different parts. So the day before they took over Kabul, in Herat, the Taliban commander instructed women not to go to the university, for example. In Kandahar, women employees at the bank were sent home and told to send the male relatives to replace them. So we had a few of those kinds of things. In one of the provinces, a former military commander was hanged. But the day after they took over Kabul, for example, Taliban members went around door to door in Kabul, encouraging parents to send their daughters to school. Yesterday, UNICEF reported that all the primary and high schools in Herat, the place where women were told not to go to university, all the primary and high schools were opened and boys and girls were both going. Yesterday, you might have also seen the media conference by the Taliban. Men and women reporters were there. They took questions from both. They answered questions from both. So in the past 4 or 5 days, we haven't seen any pattern that suggests that they want to go against the promises that they have made. So the promises include that they will protect women's right to education, that minorities will not be persecuted. They made a special effort to go to the Hazara leadership and give them that assurance. And the day that they took over Kabul, the Hazara leadership sent a delegation to meet with the Taliban in Kabul. They have promised that people that were part of the former regime, including the army, security forces, there will be no reprisals against them. There haven't been in real sense. They also, a late promise after they took over Kabul, were not so much a promise as a kind of indication that they want to form some kind of a unity government. There's strong indications that they're in talks with both Hamid Karzai and Abdullah, two former presidents under the Americans, to include them in a new government. They have improved, or they have relations now with Iran, which previously was regarded as a huge enemy because it was majority Shia country. So they've made all of these promises. They haven't gone against any of these promises yet. At this stage, I can understand if Afghan people who are living in Afghanistan feel afraid and concerned. But sitting where I am, which is very far away and very safe, my attitude would be that I think we should wait and see. Okay. They've made promises. They've stuck to them for 4 or 5 days. And the one thing about the Taliban, despite all the other things we might be very critical about them for, is they have proven in the past that they don't lie.
Okay.
Really.
Let's quickly wrap up with the Hillary Clinton comments. So
yes, the Americans sponsored a number of those so-called Mujahideen groups in the 1980s, including, as I said, Al-Qaeda, supplied them with weapons, money, all kinds of things. The Taliban, however, wasn't part of that. The Taliban emerged in 1994, 5 years after the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan. According to Ahmed Rashid, a handful of Taliban members were part of those Mujahideen groups in the past. But the Taliban was a new animal. It wasn't part of the fight against the Soviet Union, and people make this mistake and equate the two. That famous photograph that's become famous now of Ronald Reagan meeting with turbaned Afghans in the Oval Office, those were representatives of those so-called Mujahideen groups. They were not Taliban. The Taliban didn't exist at that time. So it's a new group. And as far as I know, the Taliban was not funded by the Americans. When they emerged in 1994, between 1994 and 1996, when they took over Afghanistan, some American officials did make positive comments about them. And it is said that they politically supported the Taliban, but there's no evidence that they funded them, gave them weapons, etc.
Okay.
Either then or now.
Right. Naeem, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll have to get you again on a longer show, inshallah. So much more to cover. But thank you indeed for your time, and salamu alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam.
Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center, Naeem Jeenah. Still lots to uncover with him. Hopefully we'll get him back again next week sometime.
A strip of land with over 2 million people blockaded for 13 years. Healthcare is on its knees, food is scarce, and water is inadequate. COVID has wreaked havoc in the lives of the people of Gaza. 53% of the population live below the poverty line. 80% of Gaza relies on external aid to survive. And 20,000 children are now orphans. The future is bleak. Please, don't forget Gaza. Donate now to Islamic Relief.
Looking to get your kick? Kiki's have now reopened on 235 Matthews Maiwa Road in Durban. Head on over for the taste with Kick. We offer something scrumptious for everyone in the family. Wraps, chicken tikka, burgers, tender grills, mocktails, milkshakes, and so much more. Corporate